Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Your book, Terms of Disservice, How Silicon Valley is Destructive by Design. Why did you write this book and what is its main thesis?
Well, a lot of complex reasons as to why I wrote it. You know, my government experience, my experience in the industry at Facebook, my work in engineering, all of it really kind of drove me to feel something and discover something about how the internet really works. And what drove me to write this was really to uh, essentially try to package that up into something that's consumable by lay people as to what really drives how internet companies work. What is their business model, and why is it that business model has instigated such tremendous harms that we're seeing in the public: disinformation, hateful conduct online, competition and privacy problems that are arising today. Why are these things happening? What I try to do in terms of disservice is give my theory of the case as to how we've come to this point. What is the business model that drives companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon? And how is it that their business model is connected to these tremendous social harms? And finally, what can we do about it? What can our regulators, our legislators, what can the public, we as consumers, do about this situation that we're in today to improve the future for ourselves and for our kids?
These big tech companies, presumably talking about Facebook, Google, Amazon, can you tell us about how they operate as monopolies, because they are a monopoly? And why is it that they don't have competition on our markets when they are global companies? It seems very odd.
Yeah, you know, I think this is a very important question. Let's just start in step one, and let's look at the case of Facebook, which is a company that I worked for in the policy team in Washington, D.C. Facebook, I would contend, is a monopoly. Now, the first thing that you have to do is think about what is the market that this company occupies. Um, in Facebook's case, I think we could say that it operates in the social media market. And when we think about social media, there's not really a competitor that Facebook has. There's not really another company that has as many users or has as much aggregated consumer attention for as many hours during the day as Facebook, through Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram and its broader media properties over the web. And so in a place like Australia, in a place like the United States, as competition regulators in Australia and the United States and Europe and other places have suggested, Facebook not only has a monopoly, but I think the second step is that Facebook has used its market power in ways that harm society, harm the rest of society. In the following sense: when we think about competition issues, what we try to look for is whether or not a monopoly is causing harm to market innovation, is causing harm to the consumer's personal economic situation, and indeed is causing harm through impairments in the quality of service that's being rendered to consumers. And in each of these three counts, I think Facebook is a culprit. And this is why you have entities like the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission in the United States and the European Commission bringing forward these very rigorous cases around antitrust, suggesting that there is a market power problem, a monopoly problem underlying a company like Facebook or Amazon or Google or Apple, and we need to do something about it.
In your mind, are they all as bad as each other, or does one lead the way in being the Black Knight?
Well, here too, I think there's one could answer this or address this question in different ways. I think it goes without saying that each of these is a monopoly in its own case. Google, if you look at Google, has a monopoly in segments of the consumer internet industry that are tremendously important in developed economies like the United States or Australia. For instance, Google has a monopoly in search, in email, in online video. Facebook has monopolies in friends-based social media, internet-based text messaging. Amazon has monopolies in markets like digital books and online marketplaces, e-commerce. Apple has a monopoly in closed mobile operating systems. And I think in each of these cases, the company in question drives its monopoly power to bring monopoly rents, meaning the prices that are rendered to consumers, up in an artificial way. For instance, Facebook, what Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg, the executives of Facebook, like to say often is that, well, Facebook is free. But of course it's not. And I think it's more complicated than Facebook just collecting our data. Facebook is not only collecting our data, but it's also got a monopoly over social media and is monopolizing our attention devoted to social media. And it's this combination of our attention and our data that's essentially raked at a monopolistic rate by a company like Facebook in the social media market. And it's that's so damaging to our national economies. The economy of Australia, where we only have one social media provider, and that one provider is impairing the economic system because it's a bottleneck through which every other player has to play. And so there's this economic harm in it, which is an underlying deep social issue. But also there's this problem of the tremendous harms around market innovation and quality of service and prices rendered to consumers.
What are the main threats generated by these companies, and to whom or what are they directed?
I think that the main threats are really around this problem of tremendous market power and the economic issues that come with that. When you do have a monopoly, let's take Google for instance. You can do a couple of things. First, you can start to monopolize the consumer experience in internet search or email or other sectors. And what that means is that you can start to really exploit people's data and attention and charge exploitative rates for that data and attention. We have to remember these are two-sided markets where even if Google has competition in digital advertising in the face of Facebook and Amazon and other companies, for instance, there's not much competition on the other side of the market, which is its interface with consumers in the markets of online video where we don't use anything besides YouTube, or email where we don't use anything besides Gmail. And our digital currency in the form of our data and our attention is being swallowed up by Google at exploitative rates, which Google is then able to sell on the open market to people that are trying to reach us. So there's this systemic problem where these companies are essentially natural monopolies. They've constructed these tremendously high barriers to entry as a natural organic matter, as a course of doing business, and benefit from these tremendously powerful network effects where they become more and more powerful economically as they get more and more users onto their platforms. And we're all part of this now. And I think what we have to do now is really think about how we renegotiate this balance of power between Google and the consumers, or Facebook and voters, or Amazon and readers of books.
Governments are moving towards greater regulation, but is this regulation effective or properly targeted?
Well, I think I think when we look at this specific issue of competition, Australia, through the ACCC, has done quite a lot in setting a tone globally. I should say, certainly domestically in Australia, but also the rhetoric and the policy development of the ACCC has had an international, global impact. Is it doing the right thing? Are other jurisdictions like the European Commission or the Federal Trade Commission or the U.S. Justice Department doing the right kinds of things? Well, I think so, in large part, in the following sense. First, I think we need to collect a lot of information and make assertions about the nature of the media ecosystem today. And I think all of these regulatory bodies are playing their part in getting us there. Now, some are doing better than others. Some are driven by politics to a large extent, which is not a great thing when we're talking about, of course, what should be independent economic market regulators. But I think we need to keep this up. Collect more information about how Google oversees this bottleneck in internet search, for instance, and collects all our data and engages in charging exploitative rates for it. To the extent that we can establish that Google has this market monopoly and it is using its monopoly position to prevent others, other would-be rivals from potentially having an impact in that market years down the road, we will be better off, because that will help us develop antitrust cases and potentially even competition legislative reforms in places like Australia or Washington, D.C., to try to push back against the commercial overreaches of these big four companies and potentially others.
Do you think you're right with the government here, or the ACCC in Australia, ramping up that Google must pay for, or come to an arrangement with other news bodies to pay for content, and Google have placed ads, supporting their position. Facebook have said, we don't care about news, we just won't run it. But do you think, though, that as a point, because Australia 25 million isn't a whole lot of people in this big world, as a point, if they were to cut off say, we're not going to look after Australia anymore, we're not going to do what we have been doing because we don't need you, we don't need to have this angst, and we don't want to start something that we can't stop. So do you think there is a possibility that they could stop the drip to Australia and just cut off the service and say, there you are, that's what we can do, because they're bigger combined, they're bigger than a number of countries combined?
I think that threat exists. Now let's caveat this and say and acknowledge Australia is a wealthy country, and the 25 million people of Australia represent a big economic target for companies like Facebook, which want to capture the attention of a typical Australian consumer, because a typical Australian has a propensity to make purchases, and that is something that distinguishes the Australian market, not necessarily from the American market or the European market, but certainly from other markets around the world. And I think, as such, Australia is a country that is very appealing to the likes of a Facebook or a Google in trying to essentially establish its economic force around the world. So let's first of all acknowledge that. But I think that the threat that Google will just lift its services from Australia should let's say the Australian political establishment and or regulatory community begin to establish stringent regulations or heavy taxes against Google that are that essentially go against the grain of where global where regulators are thinking around the rest of the world. I think that the threat certainly does exist, and I think there are two levels of analysis here. One is the cost-benefit analysis. Of course, you could say that, well, even if Google is taxed by Australia to such an extent, Google probably makes so much money in Australia that it can outweigh any any tax burden. And of course, that would especially be true if the tax burden is a percentage of revenues appreciated in Australia. So let's acknowledge that. But at the same time, I think these kinds of matters can very quickly become a slippery slope, so that if Australia demands a tax for some kind of a tax that's levied against Google, and which goes to the newspapers of Sydney and Brisbane and other news organizations around Australia, that could very well be a policy, a regulatory policy a tax policy that is duplicated in markets like India and Japan and France, and indeed even the United States maybe. And so Google would see that as a slippery slope, because you could have regulators in other parts of the world quickly saying, well, if Australian news organizations are going to have that levy reassigned from the tech industry, then our news organizations very well should as well, because we believe in that policy too, and you guys, the tech industry, should be giving us the same attention. And I think that's a very real threat. And if Australia were to go down that road, we would potentially see this kind of game playing out between Silicon Valley and the Australian regulatory and political establishment.
Who's more powerful, the rest of the world, or those four tech companies: Google, Amazon, Apple? Who's the other one? I've left someone out there anyway. Who's more powerful?
Facebook.
Yeah, Facebook. Sorry, how could I forget those? But I would like to. But who's more powerful? I mean, you mentioned before off camera, 6 trillion compared to, but 6 trillion, divvied by 4 is a lot more powerful than, maybe 8 trillion divvied by 116.
I think it's a brilliant point that, look, if you have these companies which together have a market capitalization of 5-6 trillion US dollars, what does that say about their power around the world, especially in emerging markets, where their economic force is competitive with the GDP of entire nations, maybe several nations put together. And I think it goes without saying that you would have to acknowledge that, yes, in certain cases, a company like Facebook, which let's say is worth $1 trillion or more, is more has more political weight and economic force than certain countries. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Well, to be fair, I think that there are other companies that in other industries that do have that kind of power. For instance, let's say Aramco, to name one. But we can't forget also that it's not really just the market capitalization of these companies that indicates their tremendous power. It's also the fact that they are the media. When we think about kids, what are kids using today? They're using the apps that are generated by these companies. They're not looking at newspapers. They're looking at these new media formats, and I think that anytime you have this kind of monopolization of media, which in my personal view is a market that is an industry that should be distinguished, that is distinct from electric markets or financial markets or whatever other, because this is, this is about human psychology and the news and how we appreciate what's happening around the world. I think that we are behooved to think about the power that these companies have in this kind of situation, and potentially consider more stringent regulation.
It's very interesting. We're again talking off camera, all the good bits before, but it's 10 years ago, 15 years ago, who would think that we would have these 4 tech companies so powerful? Who would think that we'd have a pandemic that's just stopped the world, half of it because of stupidity by governments? Who would think that we'd be talking about mining on Mars or mining on the moon? And President Trump has said, go for it. So we have the Wild West moving out to space, but instead of stagecoaches, we have spaceships. And that's scary in itself, because they may not stay in the air that long. But who would think? So the whole world has changed. Part
Yes.
of it I see the majority. It's now, because we're so computer driven, being related to these 4 tech companies. They can even sway an election, and this has been brought to the public's awareness. I suppose the word I'm looking for is awareness, that President Trump, attacking Twitter. Governments here now starting to get involved, because then they are reproducing the thoughts of a few and swaying the greater number.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't hesitate to suggest that while I wouldn't say that Facebook, or rather more specifically that the Russian disinformation operation in 2016 swung the election in the U.S. in favor of Donald Trump, I would say that it is still an open question as to whether or not the disinformation operations over companies like Facebook, most significantly, I think, did sway the election. Because when you have this situation where, Mike, as you put it, you can have a disinformation operator collect mounds and mounds of data on, let's say, the Australian voting population, and start to see where the thin cracks in society are. Of course, there are political and philosophical and economic divisions, lines in Australian society, just as there are in America or India or anywhere else. We're all humans, and we are human societies. And these kinds of thin cracks in our society do exist. Mm-hmm. And when you have a lot of data about a population, you can start to identify where those thin cracks are. And when you lease that data out to anyone willing to pay for it, you're giving that third party access to those thin cracks. And then they can start to shower those thin cracks with disinformation and conspiracy and hateful conduct and incitement to violence. And that, I think, is exactly the tactic that's being used by disinformation operators over democratic societies, and it's something that we need to be very careful of. As you put eloquently, we live in different times today, and Facebook did exist 15 years ago. I don't think I was on it. I joined it in 2006, and I remember that moment very, very well, as a matter of fact. The world has changed, and we need to change with it, I think.
Just finally, looking at especially Amazon, Google, Apple, when it works, the thing that makes them so dangerous, they appeal to the consumer or just the general public, and they produce really good stuff, though. I mean, here I am, up in arms, you're thinking that they are getting too big, but I have 5 Alexas, 3 Google devices in the house, can tell my toothbrush just about to clean my teeth for me without me being there, and I've just gone and bought something else from Google. So after all this, what they do is they really produce really good stuff for the consumer. And that probably makes them also, I mean, dangerous is probably a bad word, but makes them so popular.
There's no doubt about it. I mean, let's be clear. They make really good stuff.
They do.
And you, by the way, Mike, it sounds like you're far more tech forward than I am, because I don't have any of those devices. You know, as a matter of fact, when you have these kinds of I mean, we all own Apple devices, and I couldn't live without my iPhone and my MacBook Air, my multiple MacBook Airs.
Well, there you are. You've got them too. Not one,
Yeah,
but
oh,
many.
absolutely, absolutely.
But do they work though? Do they always work?
That's a
Not
good
all the
question.
time.
I think sometimes these things are engineered to kind of break down after a couple of years. I was just at the Apple store as a frustrated customer and told that I have to book my meeting with the Genius Bar 5 to 7 days out. So I came back home without getting my product seen. But you know, I think when you have these companies didn't get to this position by accident. They've produced good stuff. They've been first movers in a burgeoning market where we all of a sudden had a consequence of technologies. Data storage, you know, technological capacities in data storage and computer networking and the internet, and processing power, all come together and create the opportunity for these new kinds of business models to emerge. And what these four companies have done in each of their cases is figure out that, well, we can take advantage of this technological wave by establishing a particular kind of business model and a particular kind of user interface. And as first movers in our respective segments of the consumer internet industry, we can very quickly monopolize this sector for years to come. And that's precisely what they've done. And they didn't get there by accident. They produced good stuff. But at this stage, I think I would have to ask, is Apple innovating as quickly as it should be?
No, I don't think so.
Exactly.
Just finally, time's up as their producers waving the card 3, 2, 1 at me. Just quickly, they did fail on my father though. When I showed my dad the Apple Watch, I said this is a Dick Tracy watch. After saying Dick Tracy to many people who were much younger than my father, he was the only one that knew who Dick Tracy was, which is a worry on my part. But you know, when I was telling my father that I could just just command this little box sitting in the living room or the kitchen to do things, or talk to my watch and call up my friends or whatever. I think my father was looking for that white jacket for me, and he says, "Oh, he's had too many margaritas." Times are changing. I do miss sometimes simplicity of the past, but that then sounds like what my father used to say to me. So I'll leave that one alone. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we can do more of this too.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's a pleasure, and thank you so much for having me.